It didn't open with a scream, it opened with a song, a gentle breeze, a sunlit island, and a smile that felt just a little too rehearsed. The Wicker Man, 1973, is often remembered for its shocking finale, but what makes it truly unforgettable isn't the end. It's the slow, methodical unraveling of a world that looks safe, even joyful, until you realize you've been walking in circles toward fire. On the surface, it's a story about a policeman searching for a missing girl. But that's just the surface. Beneath it lies something much older, much stranger, the kind of story that doesn't just unfold, it repeats, like an old ritual, played again and again, with new believers and fresh victims. Shot in real villages, scored with ancient melodies, guided by actors who understood they weren't just delivering lines, they were participating in something unsettling, something sacred, or maybe something dangerous. It was a film mutilated by its own studio, misunderstood by its distributors, and nearly lost to time. But somehow, it endured. Not through fame, through persistence, through obsession, through quiet viewers who saw something no one had warned them about and couldn't forget it. The Wicker Man is not just a piece of folk horror, it's a cinematic relic, soaked in dread and disguised in daylight. These are 20 deeply strange, eerily true facts you probably never knew about The Wicker Man. And once you hear them, the flame never really goes out. Fact 1. A director's cut entombed beneath asphalt. There was a longer version of The Wicker Man, one that no audience ever fully got to see. It ran for over 100 minutes and was what director Robin Hardy considered to be his true vision. But that cut never reached cinemas. It never had a premiere. It never even made it into storage. Instead, it was quietly and carelessly destroyed. The studio executives at British Lion found the film baffling, too intellectual, too slow, too strange. And perhaps worst of all, they didn't think it was scary. They demanded major cuts, slashing the runtime down to just 88 minutes. But what happened next turned artistic compromise into cinematic tragedy. The footage wasn't archived, it wasn't transferred or even filed. It was thrown away, literally dumped into a landfill beneath the newly constructed M4 motorway in England, buried under layers of concrete, asphalt, and passing cars. A director's cut sacrificed to bureaucracy. For years, film historians have tried to recover what was lost. Some scenes survived in degraded VHS transfers. A few audio reels reappeared in forgotten archives. But the original negatives? Gone. Possibly forever. What did those scenes contain? Accounts say they explored Summerisle's belief system in greater detail, that they painted a more tragic portrait of Sergeant Howie, that they let the dread seep in more slowly, more deeply. But all we have now is speculation and a myth. The irony? A film about rituals and sacrifice ended up sacrificing itself. Fact 2. A village that didn't know it was performing. The fictional island of Summerisle is one of the eeriest locations in horror, not because it's dark or haunted, but because it feels authentically alive. And that unsettling realism came from the fact that many of the people on screen weren't actors at all. They were locals, real villagers cast into fictional rituals that started to look and feel uncannily real. Filmed primarily in the Scottish Highlands, including the town of Plockton, the production relied heavily on real locations and real residents. The director didn't want polished stage performances. He wanted texture. He wanted unpredictability. He wanted the kind of authenticity that only comes when people forget the cameras are rolling. The May Day rituals depicted in the film weren't just loosely inspired by ancient customs. They were painstakingly reconstructed from Celtic and pre-Christian traditions. Every chant, every mask, every movement around the maypole had historical roots. Some of the villagers already knew the dances. Others said they felt like they were remembering, not learning. What emerged wasn't a standard film set. It was something closer to a living reenactment. And for some of the cast and crew, that line between documentary and drama began to blur. Decades later, residents interviewed about the shoot described it not as filming a horror movie, but as going through a strange season. Some even refused to speak of it directly, not out of trauma but out of reverence. So when you rewatch The Wicker Man, consider this. Were you watching a performance? Or were you witnessing a ritual that simply allowed cameras in? Fact 3. The role Christopher Lee would fight for without pay. In an industry where screen legends often measure worth by paycheck size and billing order, Christopher Lee did something completely unexpected. He accepted his role in The Wicker Man with no payment, no negotiation, no contractual drama, Just a quiet, deliberate yes. Why? Because to him, this wasn't just another character, it was a liberation. After years of being typecast as Count Dracula in Hammer horror films, Lee had become disillusioned. He wanted a role with weight, one that challenged him and subverted the Gothic iconography he was so associated with. And in Lord Summerisle, he found exactly that. A character cloaked in eloquence, intelligence, and quiet menace. He didn't play Summerisle like a monster. He played him like a priest. Someone who didn't see himself as evil, but enlightened. That nuance changed the entire tone of the film. Instead of a clear-cut battle between good and evil, The Wicker Man became a war of philosophies. But Lee didn't stop at performing. When the studio effectively buried the film, refusing to promote it and dumping it into theaters as a B-picture, he took matters into his own hands. He embarked on a personal tour across the US, screening the movie for college students and film buffs, talking about it in interviews, even carrying reels in his own luggage. It was a crusade of belief. Christopher Lee didn't just act in The Wicker Man, he evangelized it. And decades later, when asked to name his greatest performance, he didn't say Dracula, he said this. Fact 4. Music meant to soothe while you burn. The soundtrack of The Wicker Man is unlike anything in horror. It doesn't scream, it doesn't growl, it doesn't even really threaten. It sings, softly, joyfully, as if to say, there's nothing to fear here. Composed by Paul Giovanni and performed by a group called Magnet, the music blends traditional British folk melodies with lyrics pulled from centuries-old pagan poems and hymns. But instead of tension, it offers warmth. The songs are seductive, melodic, almost hypnotic. But that's the trick. While Sergeant Howie unravels, the villagers don't whisper, they sing. They sing during rituals. They sing about fertility. They sing about seduction. And finally, they sing during the sacrifice, their voices rising in harmony as a man is burned alive. There are no violins screeching in terror, no ominous thuds, just flutes, fiddles, and cheerful voices. The horror is not in the music itself, but in its disconnection from pain. The film's most chilling effect isn't blood or gore, it's contrast. As Howie prays to his god, the islanders sing praises to theirs. The melodies don't break, they soar. And that's when the viewer realizes, the terror isn't in being hunted, it's in being celebrated while you're destroyed. Fact 5. One take, one fire, and no second chances. You only get to burn a giant wicker statue once. The climactic scene of The Wicker Man, where the towering effigy is set ablaze with Sergeant Howie trapped inside, was not a miniature, not a model, not a digital illusion. It was real. Constructed on a seaside cliff in Burrowhead, Scotland, the structure stood over 40 feet tall and was engineered to withstand the wind for just one day, long enough to film its destruction. The pressure was enormous. The cast and crew knew they had one shot. Once the fire started, there could be no retakes. The actors had to hit their marks. The cameras had to roll flawlessly. The flames had to rise exactly as planned. And all of it had to be captured before the structure collapsed. Inside the effigy, live animals were placed: goats, chickens, pigs. No human was harmed, of course, but the presence of real creatures added an extra layer of unease. Their panic, their cries, their movement, it was all genuine. The weather didn't help. The wind threatened to topple the statue early. The heat warped the camera lenses. Everyone on set later described the shoot as surreal, almost spiritual, as if they weren't filming a scene, but participating in something ancient. Director Robin Hardy later admitted that the fire felt symbolic, not just of the story, but of the film's own fate, created with care, ignored, then burned into memory. What they captured that day wasn't just a horror climax, it was cinema offered up like a sacrifice. Fact 6. No screaming allowed. A death delivered in defiance. As the flames crept higher and the wicker limbs began to crack, Edward Woodward made a choice that would forever alter the emotional weight of The Wicker Man's finale. He chose not to scream. It wasn't a directorial decision. It wasn't a technical limitation. It was a deeply personal conviction from the actor himself. Woodward believed that Sergeant Howie, a man of unwavering Christian faith, would not collapse into terror when faced with death. He wouldn't beg. He wouldn't cry. He would hold to his beliefs and meet the flames with scripture on his tongue. That choice created a clash of worlds more profound than any on-screen confrontation. While the villagers danced and sang joyful in their offering, Howie quoted Psalms, his voice calm but firm, like a man already halfway into heaven. The juxtaposition is chilling. The mob's celebration, his solitude, their songs, his prayers. And perhaps most hauntingly, his composure doesn't crack. He doesn't scream because he believes. And that unbroken faith becomes both admirable and tragic. Woodward later said that in remaining silent, he gave Howie dignity. But others argue that it made his fate even crueler, because in refusing to fear death, Howie proved that belief can be unshakable and still lead you straight into the fire. In that moment, no one wins. Not Howie, not the villagers, only the ritual does. Fact 7. Rewritten by a different voice, replaced by a different body. Britt Ekland's character, Willow, is one of the most iconic female figures in horror, mysterious, seductive, unapologetically pagan. But most of what audiences saw and heard wasn't entirely Britt Ekland. For reasons still debated, the filmmakers decided that her Swedish-English accent didn't match the film's setting and dubbed her entire performance with the voice of a Scottish actress. Ekland wasn't told. She found out at the premiere, sitting among the audience as her own character, opened her mouth and spoke with someone else's voice. To make matters more invasive, the infamous nude dance scene where Willow attempts to seduce Howie through a thin wall wasn't even fully performed by Ekland. She was pregnant at the time and refused to appear nude from the waist down. The solution? A body double, filmed in silhouette and edited in seamlessly. In the final cut, what audiences saw was a composite woman, Ekland's face, another woman's body, and a third woman's voice. Ekland was deeply unhappy. She later called the process exploitative and disrespectful. But ironically, the result became one of the most talked about scenes in British cinema, which raises an unsettling question. Was the scene seductive because of its mystery, or because the woman at its center was silenced and fragmented? Fact 8. The man who buried the film, then dug it back up. Producer Michael Dealey didn't believe in The Wicker Man. He didn't understand it. He didn't think it had commercial potential. And so, when it came time to release the film, he did something that would later haunt his career. He shelved it. Instead of a proper theatrical rollout, Dealey dumped the film into a double feature as the B picture paired with Nicholas Roeg's Don't Look Now. No advertising campaign, no press push, no serious attempt to explain what kind of film it was. To him, The Wicker Man was a misfire, a curiosity better left forgotten. But something strange happened. Audiences began to whisper, critics rewatched, film students analyzed. Over time, the film took root. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent. It spread quietly, like folklore. And eventually, Dealey began to see what he hadn't before, that what he dismissed as too weird was actually the reason it endured. Years later, he admitted the mistake, that in misunderstanding the film, the studio had ironically played into its own themes, destroying something it didn't understand. Just like the villagers destroyed Howie, the producer tried to bury the Wicker Man, but legends have a way of digging themselves back out. Fact 9. A pagan horror that might not be pagan at all. At first glance, The Wicker Man appears to be a straightforward warning about paganism. A Christian police officer ventures into a world of ancient rituals and ends up sacrificed. But if you watch closely, something far more subversive begins to emerge. Sergeant Howie isn't just a man of faith. He's a man of rigid conviction, unable or unwilling to consider that there may be other valid ways of living. He arrives on Summerisle not as a seeker, but as a judge. He lectures. He condemns. He refuses to adapt or even listen. The villagers, in contrast, are open in their beliefs. They celebrate life. They honor cycles. They accept pleasure, fertility, and death as intertwined. Their worldview is disturbing, yes, but it's also consistent, unified. And therein lies the twist. The film doesn't necessarily position paganism as evil. It doesn't even paint Christianity as good. Instead, it portrays both belief systems as dangerous in their extremes. One devours the individual for the collective. The other blinds the individual to nuance. In the end, Howie's downfall isn't caused by the villagers, it's caused by his own unshakable certainty that he is morally superior. He doesn't fail because he lacks faith, he fails because he refuses to question it. So, is The Wicker Man really a horror film about ancient gods? Or is it a meditation on how belief, taken too far, becomes its own kind of prison? Fact 10. A script that plays like a ritual game. Anthony Shaffer didn't just write The Wicker Man, he designed it. The screenplay doesn't unfold like a typical mystery. It functions like a trap, where every character, every line, every false clue is a deliberate move toward an inevitable end. Known for his previous work on Sleuth, Shaffer was fascinated by games of logic and manipulation. And in The Wicker Man, he constructed one of cinema's most brilliant long cons. Sergeant Howie is lured step by step, not through brute force, but through carefully constructed misdirection. Every villager he meets gives him just enough information to keep him searching. It's not just a plot. its choreography. By the time Howie reaches the final clearing and sees the towering effigy, the game is already over. The viewer realizes, almost in sync with him, that every action he took brought him exactly where they wanted. There was never a moment of free will, just the illusion of choice. That makes the ending not just tragic, but structurally poetic. The sacrifice isn't random, it's earned through ritual precision, and the audience, like Howie, was pulled in by the structure itself. Schafer didn't write a horror movie. He constructed a theological chess match where one side had already resigned and the other didn't know it was being played. Fact 11. Almost released at Christmas. It sounds like satire, but this almost happened. The Wicker Man was nearly released during the Christmas season. Studio executives, unsure of how to market the film, slotted it for a December debut, perhaps hoping to counter-program it against holiday fare. A quiet murder mystery about faith and ritual, scheduled alongside carols and nativity scenes. The filmmakers were horrified. The dissonance wasn't just bad taste, it risked burying the film completely. A movie so focused on ritual, sacrifice, and religious tension would have been received as an attack on the very season itself. Eventually, the release date was pushed, but the damage had already begun. The studio didn't understand the film, and their choices, Christmas premiere included, proved it. The mishandling became a kind of meta-commentary. Just like Howie misunderstood the island, the studio misunderstood the film. And yet, maybe the irony fits. A story about faiths clashing, about one belief system suppressing another, about the erasure of ancient customs by newer doctrines, released during the one holiday that fuses Christianity and pre-Christian traditions into one glowing celebration. Would it have flopped? Or would it have ignited exactly the kind of controversy that could have saved it? Either way, it almost happened. And maybe, in a darker version of this timeline, The Wicker Man was someone's Christmas Eve movie. Fact 12. The director who carried a grudge into history. Robin Hardy directed only a handful of films in his career, but The Wicker Man was the one he poured his soul into. It wasn't just his feature debut, it was his statement. And what the studio did to it left scars that he carried for the rest of his life. After filming Wrapped, Hardy believed he had created something bold, unsettling, and deeply unique. But what he envisioned as a slow-burn psychological fable was dismissed as unmarketable. Executives butchered the edit, deleted entire scenes, and shelved the film like an afterthought. He wasn't just disappointed, he was betrayed. In interviews spanning decades, Hardy never hid his bitterness. He described the cuts as vandalism, the release strategy as sabotage, the studio's attitude as cowardice. He believed the lost material had damaged the story's rhythm, its clarity, and its thematic impact. But Hardy didn't walk away. He spent years trying to repair the wound. He tracked down degraded prints, collaborated on partial restorations, gave lectures about the film's original structure, and when a longer version, the final cut, was finally assembled in 2013, he treated it as both an act of healing and an incomplete resurrection. Even then, he insisted, the real film, the true film, was still missing, still incomplete, still silenced beneath concrete and bureaucracy. Hardy died in 2016, but the grief he carried for The Wicker Man and what it could have been never fully died with him. Some filmmakers leave behind legacies. Robin Hardy left behind a phantom version of his masterpiece. Fact 13. Pagan symbols, hidden where you'd never think to look. There's a reason The Wicker Man doesn't feel like ordinary horror. It's not just the performances or the setting, it's the design. Every frame, every object, every background detail is filled with ritual meaning, but unlike typical horror films, it doesn't announce itself. The dread is decorative. Spirals carved into doors, animal masks with symbolic placements, crops arranged in sacred geometry, maypole dances filmed from overhead to resemble ancient fertility runes. These aren't aesthetic choices. They're coded messages, borrowed from Celtic, Norse, and early Druidic traditions, embedded into the film's very fabric. Production designer Seamus Flannery and costume designer Sue Yellen didn't create fictional religions. They referenced real ones. Rituals that once happened in fields not far from where the film was shot. The villagers aren't parodying folklore, they're resurrecting it. And the film doesn't point any of this out. It lets it exist, quietly, repeatedly, until the viewer begins to feel that something ancient is watching from the corners of every scene. Some viewers report feeling uneasy during rewatch not because of violence, but because of how natural it all seems. As if these traditions were never lost, only waiting. So the real question becomes, was The Wicker Man just inspired by old beliefs? Or was it a vessel for something older to live again? Fact 14. The poster that spoiled everything. In one of the most infamous marketing decisions in horror history, The original US theatrical poster for The Wicker Man gave away the film's ending. It wasn't subtle, it wasn't vague. It was a full-color depiction of the Wicker Man effigy engulfed in flames, with a screaming silhouette visible inside. The image was striking, yes, but it dismantled the film's slow-burn structure entirely. The story is built like a noose tightening. The audience is meant to follow Howie's investigation, questioning motives, suspecting deception, unsure whether the villagers are hiding a crime or something far worse. The reveal that Howie himself is the intended sacrifice is designed to arrive like a sudden drop. But thanks to the poster, many viewers walked into theaters already anticipating the fire. Director Robin Hardy and Christopher Lee were livid. They'd crafted the narrative to mislead, to pull the viewer into the same fog of confusion that blinds the protagonist. Spoiling the ending wasn't just careless, it was a betrayal of the film's entire emotional strategy. The studio defended the choice by calling it attention-grabbing, and it was, in the worst way. So here's the irony. A film that's all about manipulation and secrecy was undone by the one thing that was supposed to sell it its own image. Fact 15. Rejected by Cannes, too strange to be celebrated. In 1974, the producers of The Wicker Man submitted the film to the Cannes Film Festival, hoping for a second chance, a lifeline that could resurrect what the studio had tried to bury. But Cannes rejected it, quietly, unceremoniously. The reason? It didn't fit. The festival programmers described it as tonally inconsistent, structurally baffling, and too peculiar to classify. It wasn't horror, not in the traditional sense. It wasn't drama. It wasn't satire. It was something else entirely, and that made it a risk. That rejection sealed the film's outsider status. Without festival buzz or awards traction, The Wicker Man drifted further into obscurity. In the mid-70 seconds, it wasn't discussed as a cult classic. It wasn't discussed at all. And yet, that same rejection is part of what saved it. By never being absorbed into the mainstream, the film retained its strangeness, its power. It wasn't dissected in classrooms. It was passed around in bootlegs, whispered about, rediscovered, reinterpreted. Today, it appears on lists of the greatest horror films ever made, beside movies that won Oscars, that played at Cannes, that premiered at Venice. But The Wicker Man wears its absence from all of that as a badge of honor. Sometimes, being too weird to celebrate is exactly what makes you last. Fact 16. May Day was shot in a single day, and it shows. The most elaborate, chaotic, and climactic sequence in The Wicker Man, the May Day festival procession, and the final sacrifice was shot in a single day. Not because it was planned that way, because it had to be. The production had limited access to the cliffside location. The massive effigy could only stand for so long before weather would take its toll. Once they lit the Wicker Man, it couldn't be extinguished. There were no second chances. Every camera had to roll. Every performer had to hit their cue. Every step had to align. The pressure was unlike anything the crew had experienced. Real animals were placed in the structure. The winds threatened to tip the towering statue. The daylight was fading fast. The final shot, Howie screaming scripture against the sunset, had to align perfectly with the real horizon. The energy on set that day wasn't professional, it was primal. People moved faster, quieter, focused not just on finishing the scene, but on getting it right. They weren't just filming a finale, they were witnessing one. The result? A sequence that feels disturbingly real, not just in performance, but in atmosphere. You can feel the cold, the confusion, the ritual building toward inevitability. The fire was lit for the story, but you get the sense it also burned something behind the camera. Fact 17. The film that preachers warned you about. When The Wicker Man was released, it didn't provoke riots. It didn't face censorship bans, but it did something subtler and arguably more insidious. It started showing up in sermons. Across the UK, Christian leaders condemned the film not just for its content, but for its implications. The storyline wasn't just pagan, it was blasphemous. The hero, a Christian, is mocked, seduced, manipulated, and ultimately killed, while pagans celebrate. No retribution, no divine intervention, just silence. Church bulletins warned congregants. Letters were sent to local cinemas. In some towns, ministers gave homilies explaining why The Wicker Man was spiritually dangerous. Not because it was violent, but because it was persuasive. What terrified them wasn't the ritual, it was the framing. Because the villagers weren't depicted as mad, they were organized, united, joyful. Meanwhile, Howie, representing moral rigidity, looked isolated, angry, and eventually helpless. The film wasn't overtly anti-Christian, but it challenged the monopoly of Christianity as the only moral lens. and in doing so, it struck a nerve deeper than blood or fire. So while the critics debated genre, the pulpits knew exactly what it was: heresy in cinema form. Fact 18, a failed remake that accidentally rekindled the flame. In 2006, The Wicker Man was reborn, sort of. A Hollywood remake was produced, starring Nicolas Cage, with a bigger budget, American setting, and an entirely different tone. But instead of honoring the eerie precision of the original, the remake took a sharp detour into unintentional comedy. The film was widely panned. Critics called it incoherent, campy, and confused. Audiences laughed at lines like, "Not the bees," and at Cage's wildly theatrical performance. Memes were born. YouTube compilations flourished, and The Wicker Man 2006 became infamous for all the wrong reasons. But here's the twist. That failure reignited interest in the original. Viewers, especially younger ones, who had never heard of the 1973 version, began looking it up. What was the story supposed to be? What did the remake get wrong? What had been lost in translation? What they discovered wasn't just a better film, it was a different film. A quiet, cerebral, sun-drenched horror story, where the fear didn't come from monsters, but from belief, ritual, and inevitability. The 2006 version may have been a misfire, but it did what no marketing campaign ever could. It made the original feel important again. So maybe, in the end, Nicolas Cage didn't ruin The Wicker Man. He accidentally saved it. Fact 19. The ending isn't fiction, it's folklore. The image of Sergeant Howie trapped inside a burning wooden effigy might seem like pure horror invention, but it's actually drawn from real-world myth, specifically from the writings of Julius Caesar, who claimed that Celtic druids performed human sacrifices inside massive wicker structures. Historians still debate the accuracy of those accounts. Some believe Caesar exaggerated the rituals to paint the Celts as savages. Others argue that such practices may have existed in localized, isolated forms. But either way, the idea of a Wicker Man didn't originate in 1973. It was already in the blood of British folklore. Robin Hardy and screenwriter Anthony Shaffer leaned into that ambiguity. They didn't claim historical certainty. They used the myth as metaphor, a way to explore how ancient fears can survive in modern forms. And that's what makes the ending so powerful. It doesn't feel like the climax of a fictional plot. It feels like something older, remembered more than written, as if we're not watching a sacrifice but witnessing the repetition of one that's happened many times before. The horror isn't just visual. It's ancestral, because even if the Druids never built wicker men, we believed they could have, and that belief still burns. Fact 20, a film no one believed in, that no one can forget. When filming wrapped, there was no celebration, no studio party, no media blitz. The cast and crew of The Wicker Man moved on, quietly, unsure of what they had just made. The studio didn't support it. Critics didn't champion it. Even fans of horror didn't know what to make of it. It was too bright to be scary, too pagan to be Christian, too musical to be serious, too serious to be camp. It didn't fit anywhere, and yet, it stayed. Over the years, it built momentum not through advertising, but through obsession. Film schools dissected it, directors cited it, scholars wrote about it. What had once been dismissed as strange became a cult cornerstone, influencing everything from Midsommar to Apostle and beyond. Christopher Lee would later say he was proudest of this film not because of what it achieved at the time, but because of what it became. Something unforgettable, something unplaceable, a cinematic ritual. And like all good rituals, it works best when you don't realize you're part of it until it's too late. So perhaps the final irony is this: a film that no one believed in became a story about belief itself. Bonus fact: the fire was never meant to go out. In 2013, 40 years after The Wicker Man first flickered into obscurity, something extraordinary happened. A version titled The Final Cut was released. It wasn't the original, but it was as close as anyone would likely ever come. This restored version was painstakingly assembled from degraded prints, lost reels found in vaults, and fragile audio tapes discovered in long-forgotten corners of British archives. It was a labor of faith by fans, historians, and the few remaining voices who still believed the film had more to give. But even then, something was missing. The true director's cut, the one Robin Hardy first envisioned, is still lost. Presumed destroyed, gone beneath the weight of time and asphalt. The film was never properly archived. Its most vital pieces were dumped, discarded, or erased by people who didn't understand what they had. And maybe that makes it perfect. Because The Wicker Man isn't just about loss. It's about belief, about things buried and reborn, about rituals performed without certainty but with conviction. Maybe the missing footage is part of the ritual. Maybe its absence keeps the story alive. The fire that burned on screen never truly stopped. It flickers in every incomplete frame, every unanswered question, every eerie smile that lingers a second too long. You can watch the restoration, but you'll never see the whole thing. And that might be exactly how it was meant to be. The Wicker Man doesn't end when the credits roll. It lingers in symbols, in silence, in the uncomfortable feeling that maybe, just maybe, you weren't watching fiction. Now we want to know, which fact stayed with you long after the fire went out? Was it the missing footage beneath a motorway? The real flames? The borrowed body and stolen voice? Or the possibility that the ritual never really ended? Leave a comment. Tell us what you saw in the ashes and what film you think we should uncover next. And if you made it this far, you're already part of the circle. Subscribe, share, but mostly stay curious. Because belief, like fire, spreads best in silence.